right now. Contingency strength is how resistant or how taught a behavior is. So for example, if every single day I go upstairs and I make myself a cup of coffee by pressing a button on my coffee machine, and that happens over the course of the year, well, guess what? A year from now, I'm probably going to still be doing the same thing. Walk upstairs, press the button, make my coffee. If all of a sudden, after 2 years of doing that, if every time I press that button, coffee appears, and after 2 years, I press that button and coffee doesn't appear, what's probably going to happen? Well, I'm probably going to press it again, maybe a couple more times, try and fix it. I'm essentially going to go through a longer extinction curve, still trying different things to get my coffee, because I have a long history of reinforcement. I have a strong contingency strength of pressing a button and getting coffee. Now, on the other hand, if I go to a local coffee shop and I don't know how their coffee machine works, and I walk up and I press one button and I have no history of reinforcement, well, then I'm probably just going to walk away or ask for help, because I don't have any contingency strength associated with this new behavior of touching a new coffee maker's button and expecting coffee. So in this new environment, I have a low contingency strength. In this old environment, I have a high contingency strength. And that's going to change the way I interact with the variables. So contingency strength, think of it as how taught or how stuck a behavior is. Now, when it comes to contingency strength, we can start looking at a couple specific ways to classify. We're not going to go into all of this just yet because we're going to go into it a little bit later, but I just want you to start thinking about contingency strength and classifying situations that happen in different categories. For example, if the response occurs and then the reinforcer occurs, right, that would be A. If the response occurs but the reinforcer does not occur, B. If the response occurs, if the response does not occur and the reinforcer does, now it's a C. If you're familiar with Punnett squares in biology, well, surprise, we're back there. All this does is gives us a way to classify things so that we can then do a little bit of math later and start to see the manipulation of the contingency strength. We'll go into this more in a little bit, but I just want to introduce that so we can chew on it as we talk about. Oh, I'm sorry. I moved the other reading towards later on in the presentation. So we're actually going to go into contingency strength right now. So contingency strength is the probability that future behavior will result in stimuli being provided based on past events. Like I said, stronger the contingency, not consistency, stronger the contingency, the more robust and consistent. Here's another example. I go to the grocery store once a week with my kids. Every single time I go to the grocery store, we turn to the right and go get a free cookie because we go to Publix. If they ever moved their bakery to the other side of the store, my 5-year-old would over and over again walk to the store, turn to the right, see there's no cookie, and then try and find it somewhere else. Because I took him so many times and he's so reinforced by going right, there's a strong contingency strength. On the other flip side, if I go to a new grocery store that he doesn't recognize, he's not going to turn to the right because there's no contingency strength associated with that behavior in this new environment. Let's put some of this stuff in practice. Why does it matter? Well, contingency strength starts to let you understand how the history interacts with the current barriers. I think we've all kind of heard the phrasing of the older the learner, the more stuck they are in their ways, and it's harder to change that behavior, right? Well, that's contingency strength. The longer the history, the stronger the contingency strength. But contingency strength approaches 1 and then goes all the way down to -1 because contingency strength is a calculation of the probability something happens minus the probability something doesn't happen. So, for example, in the ISCA test condition, every time you start an ISCA test condition, you are starting with play. You're having your HRE, you're having a good time, and then you introduce a challenge. You introduce the approaching EO, you clap, stand up, etc., and you present the establishing operation that you presume encourages the behavior to happen. So let's say you put work on the table and you take the toys away and the client hits you. All right, so behavior has happened. What happens immediately after the behavior? Work goes away, toys come back in. So behavior, reinforcer, every single time. Every time a behavior happens, a reinforcer is provided. Therefore, the contingency strength on the ISCA is 1 for that behavior, right? Because every time the behavior happens, the reinforcer appears. The reinforcer does not appear unless the behavior happens. So there's a strong conditional probability that reinforcer occurs after behavior, and there is no unconditional probability that it occurs when it doesn't. Similarly, let's talk about extinction. Every time a behavior occurs, there's no reinforcer following. So behavior occurs 3 times, no reinforcement occurs as well. So rather than being a +1 contingency strength, it's actually on the flip side. The reinforcer has a 100% chance of occurring if behavior is not occurring, right? So if there is no behavior happening, then there's a probability for reinforcement to occur, or a -1. Technically, depending on the way you do the math, and we're not going to get into the specifics, this also technically is like a null because you can't divide by 0. Let's look at FCT. FCT has 2 different components when done traditionally. There's a manding, reinforcing a mand 100% of the time, and using extinction to put the behavior, to reduce the severe behavior. So for FCT, we have 2 interventions and thus 2 contingency strengths. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the contingency strength of the mand, and what's the contingency strength of the severe behavior? The mand is on an FR1 schedule, right? So every time a mand appears, reinforcement closely follows. Every time a mand, they get reinforced. Therefore, the contingency strength is all the way up at 1, right? So the mand has a contingency strength of 1, and extinction has a contingency strength of -1, or like I said, null. So if you have 2 options, if the learner has 2 options, they can either mand and have a basically 100% chance to get what they want, or they can have a severe behavior and they have a 0% chance, or maybe even a -% chance to get what they want. Well, what is the learner going to do? Because there's a stronger contingency strength in the mand, they're going to engage in the mand. And that's why FCT works so well, because the FCR, the functional communication response, or the mand, has such a higher contingency strength than the severe behavior. And thus we start getting into how contingency strength really starts to seep into our intervention and how we can change things when things aren't going well. FCT works not because of, I would argue, not because of the prompts, not because of the stimulus, not because of the errorless learning or the least to most. At its core, FCT works because we have a super strong contingency strength for the mand and a super low contingency strength for the severe behavior. That's why it is the most common intervention, I would argue, in behavior analysis, because of that massive difference. Now, we'll go into NCR and extinction a little bit later, but just know that there's levels to the way contingency strength interacts. For this ISCA condition, for this extinction example, and for this FCT example, we're assuming 100% fidelity. Start changing the fidelity, and things start getting a little weird. And we'll go into that, an example of that a little bit later.